She sat invisible in seat 14C, a woman in jeans nobody noticed. The businessman ignored her. Flight attendants forgot her face. Even the trained air marshal, whose job was observing threats, looked directly at her twice and saw nothing remarkable. Then both pilots collapsed unconscious, and this ordinary passenger revealed she was a military test pilot who could save them all. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the terminal as passengers filed through Gate 47, each carrying their own stories, destinations, and expectations for Flight 2847 from Denver to Boston. Among them walked Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her mid-30s wearing comfortable jeans, a simple navy blue sweater and well-worn sneakers that suggested she was just another traveler heading home or perhaps to visit family. Her brown hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she carried a small backpack and rolling suitcase that looked no different from dozens of others moving through the crowded boarding area. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything extraordinary, and the gate agents barely glanced at her boarding pass before waving her through with the same mechanical smile they had given 200 other passengers that morning. Sarah made her way down the jet bridge and stepped onto the Boeing 737, nodding politely to the flight attendants who stood at the entrance greeting passengers with practiced enthusiasm. "Welcome aboard," said the senior flight attendant, a woman named Jennifer with bright red lipstick and perfectly styled blonde hair. "Seat 14C is on your right, about halfway down." Sarah thanked her and moved down the narrow aisle, squeezing past other passengers who were struggling to fit oversized bags into overhead compartments. She found her middle seat between a businessman already absorbed in his laptop and a young woman listening to music through expensive headphones. Neither looked up as Sarah settled into her seat, buckled her seatbelt, and pulled out a paperback novel from her backpack. The businessman, wearing an expensive suit and tie, finally glanced over as Sarah accidentally bumped his elbow while adjusting her position. "Sorry," she said with an apologetic smile. He nodded curtly and returned to his spreadsheet, clearly considering her just another inconvenient middle-seat passenger interrupting his work. The young woman on Sarah's other side never even acknowledged her presence, lost in whatever music was flowing through her headphones. Around them, the cabin filled with the usual sounds of boarding, crying babies, laughter, complaints about legroom, and flight attendants making announcements that most passengers ignored. 3 rows behind Sarah sat Marcus Webb, a man in his early 40s with the kind of forgettable face that seemed designed to blend into any crowd. He wore khaki pants, a plain gray polo shirt, and reading glasses that made him look like a college professor or perhaps an accountant. As he settled into his aisle seat and pulled out a magazine, none of the surrounding passengers would have guessed that Marcus was a federal air marshal, trained to identify threats and protect the aircraft from hijacking, terrorism, or other security dangers. His eyes swept the cabin with practiced casualness, noting exits, assessing passengers, and identifying anyone who might pose a risk. His gaze passed over Sarah twice without any particular interest. She looked exactly like what she appeared to be, just another ordinary passenger heading to Boston for unremarkable civilian reasons. Marcus had been doing this job for 8 years, and he had developed an instinct for spotting potential problems. The nervous teenager in row 7 who kept fidgeting worried him slightly until he noticed the boy was simply anxious about flying. The man in row 22 who boarded last and seemed agitated caught his attention until Marcus saw him smile at his wife and calm down. But Sarah in 14C registered as completely normal, perhaps a teacher heading home after visiting family, or maybe a sales representative traveling for business. Nothing about her posture, behavior, or demeanor suggested she was anything other than what she appeared to be. Marcus made a mental note of her presence the same way he noted everyone else, then dismissed her as requiring no special attention. The flight attendants moved through their pre-flight routine with efficient professionalism. Jennifer stopped at row 14 and asked if anyone needed anything before departure. The businessman ordered a coffee for after takeoff, the young woman shook her head without removing her headphones, and Sarah politely declined with a simple, "No thank you, I'm fine." Jennifer smiled and moved on, already forgetting the interaction before she reached the next row. Another flight attendant, a young man named Derek, walked past doing a seatbelt check, barely glancing at Sarah as he confirmed her belt was fastened. To him, she was just passenger number 127, occupying seat 14C, requiring no more attention than any other compliant traveler who had followed basic safety instructions. In the cockpit, Captain James Harrison and First Officer Michael Chen were completing their pre-flight checklist with the relaxed confidence of professionals who had flown this route hundreds of times. Captain Harrison, a 52-year-old veteran with 28 years of flying experience, joked with his younger co-pilot about the previous night's baseball game while his hands moved through practiced motions, flipping switches and checking instruments. Michael, 34 and ambitious, had been flying commercially for 6 years and considered himself fortunate to be paired with a captain who was both skilled and easy to work with. Neither man had any reason to suspect that this flight would be anything other than routine. The Boeing 737 pushed back from the gate exactly on time, and Captain Harrison's voice came over the intercom with the standard welcome announcement. "Good morning, folks, this is Captain Harrison from the flight deck. We're number 3 for takeoff this morning, and we're expecting a smooth flight to Boston with an arrival time of approximately 1:45 p.m. Eastern Time. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure." Sarah listened to the announcement with mild interest, the same as hundreds of other passengers, though something in the captain's tone and the professional precision of his words resonated with her in a way that others might not have noticed. She had heard thousands of such announcements in her life, and she could tell when a pilot truly knew his craft. The aircraft taxied to runway 34, and within minutes the engines roared to life as the plane accelerated down the tarmac. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of takeoff, the moment when the nose lifted and the wheels left the ground, that magical instant when tons of metal defied gravity through nothing more than physics, engineering and human skill. She saw the ground fall away through the window past the young woman beside her, watched the airport buildings shrink to toy size, and felt the aircraft bank gently as it turned eastward toward Boston. The businessman beside her never looked up from his laptop. The young woman kept her eyes closed, still lost in her music. Marcus, the Air Marshal 3 rows back, was watching a mother struggle with a fussy toddler, making sure the situation remained just normal parental stress and nothing concerning. As the aircraft climbed through 10,000 feet and the seatbelt sign chimed off, the cabin settled into the usual cruise routine. Flight attendants began preparing the beverage service, passengers retrieved laptops and tablets from bags, and the hum of conversation filled the cabin. Jennifer wheeled her cart down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks with the same questions she had asked on thousands of previous flights. When she reached row 14, the businessman ordered tomato juice, the young woman asked for a Coke, and Sarah requested just water with no ice. "Coming right up, hon," Jennifer said cheerfully, already reaching for the cups before Sarah had finished speaking. She handed over the drinks, collected the money from the businessman who wanted a snack box, and moved on without any further interaction. Sarah sipped her water and returned to her novel, a thriller about international espionage that seemed amusing to her given the gap between fiction and reality she had experienced in her own career. The businessman beside her was now on a phone call, speaking quietly about some corporate merger that clearly stressed him. "I don't care what Thompson says," he muttered into his phone, "the numbers don't work unless we restructure completely." He glanced at Sarah to see if she was listening, but she appeared completely absorbed in her book, just another passenger with no interest in his business problems. He relaxed and continued his call, never imagining that the woman beside him had once commanded multi-million-dollar aircraft in combat situations where a single miscalculation meant death. What none of the passengers knew, what the flight attendants had not been told, and what even the pilots were unaware of, was that the catering service had made a catastrophic error that morning. A refrigeration unit had failed overnight in the facility where crew meals were prepared, and bacteria had multiplied to dangerous levels in the food intended for the flight deck. The meals had passed visual inspection because nothing appeared wrong, but every bite contained enough contamination to cause severe illness. Captain Harrison and First Officer Chen had eaten their crew meals shortly after reaching cruising altitude, a standard practice that had never caused any concern in decades of flying. Now, as Flight 2847 cruised peacefully at 37,000 feet over Kansas, both men were about to face a medical crisis that would transform this routine flight into every passenger's worst nightmare. In the cockpit, Captain Harrison suddenly felt a wave of nausea that made him grip the control yoke tighter. He attributed it to turbulence at first, but there was no turbulence. The instruments showed smooth air, stable altitude, and perfect conditions. Beside him, First Officer Chen pressed a hand to his stomach and grimaced. "You okay?" Harrison asked, his own discomfort growing by the second. "I don't know," Chen replied, his face going pale. "I feel really strange, like I might—" He didn't finish the sentence before he was fumbling for the cockpit air sickness bag, his body suddenly rebelling against him. Harrison felt sweat break out on his forehead as his own stomach churned violently. "We need to get on the ground," he said, reaching for the radio to declare an emergency, but his hand felt heavy and uncoordinated. His vision began to blur, and the instrument panel seemed to swim before his eyes. Chen was already incapacitated, slumped in his seat and barely conscious as his body fought the massive bacterial infection coursing through his system. Harrison tried to key the microphone, but his fingers wouldn't obey his commands. The last coherent thought he had was that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong, and then his world went dark as he collapsed forward against the controls. The Boeing 737 continued flying on autopilot, maintaining its altitude and heading exactly as programmed, but in the cockpit both pilots were unconscious and deteriorating rapidly. No one in the cabin had any idea that anything was wrong. The aircraft flew smoothly, the engines hummed their normal song, and passengers continued reading, sleeping, working, and chatting without the slightest concern. Jennifer was taking orders in the back of the cabin, Derek was restocking supplies in the galley, and Marcus was observing a teenager who seemed too interested in the cockpit door, though the interest appeared innocent enough. It was Derek who first noticed something wrong. Crew protocol required the flight attendants to check on the pilots periodically, and it had been nearly 40 minutes since the last check. He knocked on the cockpit door using the standard pattern, waited, and knocked again when there was no response. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes pilots were busy with air traffic control communications or were in the middle of important tasks. He knocked a third time louder and called out, "Crew entry." Still no response. Now his concern escalated to worry. He used the intercom phone that connected directly to the cockpit, and it rang without anyone picking up. Derek's heart began to race as he realized something was seriously wrong. He entered the emergency access code on the cockpit door keypad, the code that could override the lock from inside, and pushed the door open. What he saw made his blood run cold. Both Captain Harrison and First Officer Chen were slumped in their seats, unconscious, with the visible signs of severe illness evident even to his untrained eyes. "Oh my God," Derek whispered, frozen for a moment in shock. Then his training kicked in and he shouted down the cabin, "Jennifer! Medical emergency. Cockpit. Now." The word cockpit, spoken with that level of urgency, sent a ripple of alarm through the nearby passengers. Jennifer rushed forward, her face going white when she saw the incapacitated pilots. "Are they breathing?" she asked, pushing past Derek to check for vital signs. "Yes, but barely conscious," Derek replied, his voice shaking. "What do we do?" Jennifer's mind raced through every emergency procedure she had been trained for, but this scenario was beyond anything she had prepared for. 2 pilots down simultaneously was supposed to be virtually impossible. Her hands trembled as she reached for the PA system. Marcus had heard the commotion and was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his air marshal instincts telling him that something significant was happening. He moved quickly down the aisle, flashing his credentials to Jennifer as he reached the cockpit. "Federal Air Marshal," he said quietly but firmly. "What's the situation?" Jennifer looked at him with desperate hope, as if his authority might somehow fix the impossible situation. "Both pilots are unconscious," she said, her voice barely controlled. "They're sick, really sick, and I don't know what to do. There's no one to fly the plane." Marcus looked past her into the cockpit and felt his stomach drop. His training had prepared him for hijackers, terrorists, violent passengers, even scenarios involving biological or chemical threats. But he had no training for flying an aircraft. He couldn't help with this. He was as helpless as any other passenger when it came to actually controlling the plane. "We need to find out if there's a pilot on board," he said, forcing his voice to remain calm even as his mind calculated their chances of survival. "Make an announcement. Ask if anyone has flying experience. Anyone at all." Jennifer nodded and grabbed the PA microphone with shaking hands. Her voice came over the speakers, and this time every passenger heard the fear beneath her professional tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a serious emergency. We need to know immediately if there is anyone on board with flying experience. Any kind of flying experience at all. Please identify yourself to a flight attendant right away. This is extremely urgent." The cabin erupted in confused murmurs and frightened questions. The businessman next to Sarah looked up from his laptop in alarm. The young woman removed her headphones, her eyes wide. All around the cabin, passengers were turning to look at each other, hoping anyone would stand up and claim they could fly. Sarah felt her heart rate increase but kept her expression neutral. She knew exactly what that announcement meant. She knew that in the cockpit, both pilots were down, and she knew that this aircraft full of terrified people was now flying on autopilot with no one capable of landing it. She also knew that she was probably the only person on this aircraft who had the skills to do anything about it. But revealing herself meant exposing a past she had carefully left behind, meant stepping back into a world she had walked away from, meant becoming visible when she had worked so hard to remain invisible. For 15 long seconds nobody moved. Passengers looked around desperately and Jennifer's voice came back over the PA, now clearly panicked. Please, if anyone has any flying experience, even small aircraft, please come forward now. We desperately need your help. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, took a deep breath, and made her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, raising her hand. I can fly, she said quietly, her voice steady and calm in contrast to the rising panic around her. Every head in the nearby rows turned to stare at her. The businessman looked at her in complete shock, as if the woman who had been sitting silently beside him for an hour had suddenly transformed into a different person entirely. Marcus pushed his way through the gathering crowd of concerned passengers to reach her. You can fly, he asked, studying her face intently, trying to assess if she was serious or delusional. What's your experience? Sarah met his eyes with a level gaze that had stared down far more intimidating people than a federal agent. I'm a former military test pilot with over 4,000 hours, she said. I've flown everything from trainers to advanced tactical aircraft. I can handle this plane. Marcus felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. This ordinary-looking woman in casual clothes who had been sitting unnoticed in a middle seat was claiming to be one of the most qualified pilots imaginable. Can you prove that? He asked, knowing they didn't have time for lengthy verification but needing some confirmation. Sarah pulled out her wallet and handed him a card that he recognized immediately, a Department of Defense ID that was still valid. Her credentials were legitimate. She was exactly who she claimed to be. My God, Marcus breathed. You've been sitting there the whole time. Jennifer grabbed Sarah's arm with desperate relief. Can you really land this plane? She asked, tears forming in her eyes. Can you save us? Sarah looked at the flight attendant with complete confidence. Get me to the cockpit, she said. And get on the radio to air traffic control. Tell them we have a dual pilot incapacitation and that a qualified pilot is taking command. They'll need to clear our approach and get emergency services ready. Her voice carried such authority that both Jennifer and Marcus moved immediately to obey, their bodies responding to the command presence of someone who had led in genuine crisis situations. As Sarah moved toward the cockpit, passengers realized what was happening, and the cabin filled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. A woman in row 10 grabbed Sarah's arm as she passed. Please save us, she begged, her voice breaking. I have 2 children at home. Sarah paused just long enough to look the woman in the eye and say with absolute certainty, I will get us down safely. I promise you that. There was something in her tone, some quality of unshakable confidence, that made the woman release her arm and nod, choosing to believe in this stranger who had appeared from nowhere to save them all. Sarah entered the cockpit and immediately assessed the situation with the clinical precision of someone trained to process emergencies. Both pilots were alive but deeply unconscious, their vital signs weak, their bodies clearly fighting severe illness. The autopilot was engaged and holding the aircraft steady at 37,000 feet on their programmed course to Boston. The instruments showed all systems functioning normally. This was both good and bad. Good because the aircraft itself was fine, bad because she was going to have to manually fly an approach and landing in an aircraft she had never flown before, with hundreds of lives depending on her getting it exactly right the first time. She quickly but carefully moved Captain Harrison's unconscious body out of the left seat, with Marcus helping to lift the deadweight. They secured him as safely as possible in the jump seat, then did the same with First Officer Chin. Sarah slid into the captain's chair and immediately began scanning the instruments, her hands moving over the controls with practiced efficiency. The layout was familiar enough. She had studied commercial aircraft operations as part of her test pilot training, and the fundamental principles of flight remained constant whether you were flying a fighter jet or a Boeing 737. But knowing principles and actually executing a safe landing were 2 entirely different things. She grabbed the radio and keyed the mic. Denver Center, this is Flight 2847, we have an emergency. Her voice was calm and professional, carrying none of the panic that would have been expected in this situation. The air traffic controller's response came immediately. Flight 2847, Denver Center, go ahead with your emergency. Sarah took a breath and delivered the information concisely. Denver Center, Flight 2847 has experienced dual pilot incapacitation due to apparent food poisoning. I am a passenger with military flight experience taking control of the aircraft. I need vectors to the nearest suitable airport and I need emergency services standing by. There was a brief pause as the controller processed this unprecedented situation, then his voice came back, now more focused and urgent. Flight 2847, understand you have dual pilot incapacitation and a passenger is flying. Can you confirm your qualifications? Sarah's response was crisp. I'm a former military test pilot with 4,000 hours, qualified on multiple aircraft types including jets. I can fly this aircraft, but I'll need assistance with the specific systems and approach procedures. What's my nearest suitable airport? The controller's voice carried new confidence. Flight 2847, your nearest major airport is Kansas City International, currently 60 miles southeast of your position. I'm clearing all traffic and notifying emergency services. Can you accept vectors? Affirmative, Denver Center, Sarah replied. Ready for vectors to Kansas City. I'm currently on autopilot, but I'll need to hand fly the approach. I need you to talk me through the specific procedures for this aircraft type. The controller responded immediately. Flight 2847, turn right heading 120, descend and maintain flight level 240. I'm getting a supervisor here who's a former airline pilot. He'll assist with the approach procedures. Sarah acknowledged and smoothly disengaged the autopilot, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch on the controls. The Boeing 737 was heavier and less responsive than the tactical aircraft she was used to, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Lift, thrust, drag and gravity, the four forces that governed all flight. She knew them as intimately as she knew her own heartbeat. She began the turn and descent, her movements smooth and calculated. In the cabin behind her, passengers felt the aircraft bank and begin descending, and word had spread that a passenger was now flying the plane. Some people prayed, some cried, some held hands with strangers, and some simply sat in numb silence trying to comprehend their situation. The businessman from 14C stood in the aisle staring toward the cockpit, unable to believe that the unremarkable woman who had sat beside him was now all that stood between 200 people and certain death. I had no idea, he kept muttering to anyone who would listen. She was just sitting there. I had absolutely no idea. Sarah's hands moved over the controls with increasing confidence as she felt the aircraft's responses and adjusted to its characteristics. Denver Center, Flight 2847 is level at 24,000, heading 120, she reported. Requesting approach briefing for Kansas City. The supervisor's voice came on, and she could hear the professional respect in his tone. Flight 2847, this is Kansas City Tower Supervisor. I'm a former 737 captain and I'm going to walk you through everything. First, what's your fuel status? Sarah scanned the fuel gauges. Showing approximately 12,000 pounds remaining, she said. More than sufficient for the approach and landing. Good, the supervisor said. Now here's what we're going to do. I'll guide you through a visual approach to runway 19 left. Weather is clear, winds are light, you'll have perfect conditions. The key is going to be managing your airspeed and descent rate. This aircraft likes to float if you come in too fast, so we're going to keep you a little slow on the approach. Set your transponder to 7700. Sarah's fingers found the transponder without hesitation. Squawking 7700, she confirmed. Marcus watched from the cockpit doorway as Sarah worked through the procedures, and he found himself filled with a profound sense of awe mixed with chagrin. He was trained to observe people, to identify threats and assess capabilities, and he had looked directly at this woman multiple times and seen nothing remarkable. She had been perfectly camouflaged as ordinary, and he had missed completely that he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. Now he watched her hands move over controls she had never touched before with the confidence of a surgeon, and he felt humbled by his failure to recognize her capabilities. Flight 2847, descend to 10,000 feet, the supervisor instructed. Start slowing to 210 knots. Sarah smoothly reduced thrust and lowered the nose, beginning the descent while simultaneously bleeding off speed. Descending to 10,000, slowing to 210, she acknowledged. Behind her she could hear Jennifer on the PA system updating passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing in Kansas City. The pilot in command is highly qualified and we are in contact with air traffic control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and listen carefully for instructions from the flight attendants. As the aircraft descended through 15,000 feet, Captain Harrison began to stir slightly in the jump seat. His eyes fluttered but didn't open and he made a small groaning sound. Marcus moved to check on him, feeling for his pulse and finding it stronger than before. He might be coming around, Marcus said to Sarah, but he's in no condition to help. Sarah nodded without taking her eyes off the instruments. Understood, she said. I've got the aircraft. Those 4 words carried the weight of complete responsibility, the declaration that she was in command and everything that happened next was on her shoulders. Flight 2847, you're 60 miles from the airport, the supervisor's voice came through. Begin configuring for landing. Extend your flaps to position 5. Sarah's eyes scanned the center console until she found the flap lever. She moved it to the indicated position and felt the aircraft's nose pitch up slightly as the flaps deployed. Flaps 5, she confirmed, making a trim adjustment to compensate. Good, the supervisor said. Now reduce speed to 190 knots and descend to 5,000 feet. The Kansas City skyline became visible in the distance as Sarah brought the aircraft down through the clouds. She could see the airport ahead, the runways clearly visible in the afternoon sun. I have the airport in sight, she reported, feeling confidence surge through her. Flight 2847, you're cleared for visual approach runway 19 left, came the response. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Extend your flaps to 15 and reduce speed to 160 knots. Sarah's hands moved smoothly through the configuration changes. Flaps 15, slowing to 160. The aircraft settled into the new configuration, and she adjusted the descent rate to maintain a proper glide path. In the cabin, passengers pressed against windows to see the ground approaching. Some were crying, some were silent, all were terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Jennifer and Derek had prepared everyone for emergency landing positions, and now they moved through the cabin one final time, checking seatbelts and offering what comfort they could. The young woman who had sat beside Sarah in 14C was gripping her armrests so hard her knuckles were white. She can do this, the businessman beside her said, trying to convince himself as much as her. She's got thousands of hours. She knows what she's doing. Flight 2847, you're 10 miles out, the supervisor said, emotion creeping into his voice. Extend gear and flaps to 30. Final speed should be 140 knots. Sarah reached for the landing gear lever and lowered it, feeling the aircraft shudder slightly as the wheels extended into the slipstream. She moved the flaps to 30 degrees and reduced power, letting the speed bleed down to 140 knots. Gear down, 3 green lights, flaps 30 on speed, she reported with precision. The runway was growing larger in the windscreen now, and she made small corrections to keep the aircraft aligned perfectly with the centerline. You're looking perfect, the supervisor said, his voice thick with emotion now. Maintain your approach speed, keep it smooth, you're doing great. Sarah's hands made tiny inputs to the controls, responding to wind shifts and adjusting the descent rate with movements so small they were almost invisible. This was the art of flying, the ability to become one with the machine, to feel through the controls what the aircraft needed. She had learned this art in the most demanding aircraft ever built, and now she applied every bit of that skill to bringing this Boeing 737 safely to the ground. 500 feet, the supervisor called out. Looking good. Sarah's eyes moved in a smooth scan, checking airspeed, altitude, descent rate, and the runway picture ahead. 400 feet. 300 feet. 200 feet. She began the flare, smoothly pulling back on the yoke to raise the nose and reduce the descent rate. 100 feet. 50 feet. The runway rushed up to meet them. 30 feet. 20 feet. 10 feet. The main wheels touched the runway with barely a bump, a landing so smooth that passengers didn't realize they were on the ground until they heard the engines roar into reverse thrust. Sarah deployed the spoilers and applied the brakes with careful modulation, bringing the aircraft's speed down smoothly and under complete control. The Boeing 737 rolled down runway 19 left with emergency vehicles racing alongside, their lights flashing, ready to respond if needed. But they weren't needed. Sarah had executed a textbook landing, better than many commercial pilots achieved on their best days. As the aircraft slowed to taxi speed, Sarah's voice came over the radio one final time. Kansas City Tower, Flight 2847 is down safely. We'll need immediate medical assistance for our 2 pilots. The tower supervisor's voice came back, clearly emotional. Flight 2847, that was exceptional. Medical teams are approaching now. On behalf of everyone here, thank you. You just saved 200 lives. Sarah took a deep breath, the first one she had allowed herself since taking control, and replied simply, just doing what needed to be done. She brought the aircraft to a stop on the taxiway and set the parking brake, then began the shutdown procedures. Behind her, the cockpit door opened wider and Marcus stood there with tears in his eyes. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I watched you the whole flight. I'm trained to see threats, to identify people who don't belong. And I looked right at you and saw nothing. I missed completely that you were probably the most qualified person on this entire aircraft. Sarah turned to face him with a small smile. That was kind of the point. I left that life behind. I wanted to be invisible, just another passenger. Marcus shook his head in wonder. Well, you can't be invisible now. You just saved 200 people and executed a landing that pilots with thousands of hours on this aircraft would be proud of. The cabin erupted in applause and cheering as passengers realized they were truly safe. Flight attendants were crying and hugging each other, and passengers who had been strangers were embracing like family. Emergency medical technicians rushed aboard to treat the unconscious pilots, and paramedics began evacuating them to the hospital. Captain Harrison had regained partial consciousness and was aware enough to understand his aircraft had been safely landed. He looked up at Sarah with confusion and gratitude. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper. Sarah knelt beside him as the paramedics prepared to move him. "Just a passenger," she said gently. "Just someone who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills." Harrison's hand gripped hers weakly. "You saved everyone. Thank you." Sarah squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Get better, Captain. Your aircraft is fine and everyone is safe." The paramedics lifted Harrison onto a stretcher and carried him off, followed by First Officer Chen, who was also beginning to show signs of recovery. As passengers began deplaning, many stopped to thank Sarah personally. The businessman from seat 14B approached with shame written across his face. "I sat next to you for an hour," he said. "I was rude, I ignored you, I treated you like you were nobody. And you were the one person who could save us. I'm so sorry." Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. "You have nothing to apologize for. I wanted to be nobody. You only saw what I wanted you to see." The young woman from seat 14A hugged Sarah tightly. "I'm alive because of you," she sobbed. "My family is going to see me again because of you." Sarah returned the hug, feeling the weight of what she had done. 200 people who had woken up expecting a routine flight were going home to their families because she had been on that aircraft. News of the emergency landing spread rapidly. Passengers had been posting updates, and within hours Sarah's name and face were everywhere. Passenger lands plane after both pilots collapse. Hero passenger executes perfect emergency landing. News crews descended on Kansas City Airport, all wanting interviews with the woman who had performed one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history. Sarah sat in an airport conference room, still in her casual jeans and navy sweater. Marcus sat with her, having refused to leave. "You're handling this well," he observed. "Most people would be falling apart." Sarah smiled tiredly. "I'm processing it. It hasn't fully hit me yet. The emotional reaction will come later." The airline had rebooked passengers on other flights, but many had left messages for Sarah. The young woman from 14A wrote that she was getting married in 3 months and Sarah would forever be part of her wedding story. The businessman left his card saying if Sarah ever needed anything he would provide it. Captain Harrison and First Officer Chen were stable at the hospital, receiving treatment for severe food poisoning. They had requested to speak with Sarah, wanting to thank the woman who had saved their lives and their aircraft. As evening fell, Sarah agreed to one press conference. She walked into a room filled with cameras and reporters shouting questions. She raised her hand for quiet, and the authority in that gesture silenced the room. "I'll make a brief statement," she said calmly. "This morning I boarded as an ordinary passenger. When both pilots became incapacitated, I stepped forward because of my military training. I didn't do anything heroic. I applied skills I was fortunate to have learned. The real heroes are the flight attendants who kept everyone calm and the air traffic controllers who guided me through unfamiliar procedures." A reporter shouted, "But you landed a plane you'd never flown." Sarah smiled slightly. "Flying is flying. The principles remain constant. I had excellent guidance, perfect weather, and a functioning aircraft. Any competent pilot should have been able to execute that landing." Another reporter asked why she was keeping her background secret. "I wasn't keeping secrets," Sarah said. "I left military service because I wanted a normal life. Today reminded me that sometimes we don't choose when our skills are needed." "What will you do now?" a journalist asked. Sarah paused. 24 hours ago I was content with my quiet life. Now I'm questioning whether I've been selfish in walking away. I have skills that could help people. I need time to figure out what comes next." After the conference, Marcus told her, "I've been an air marshal for 8 years. I've never seen anyone demonstrate the calm competence you showed today. You didn't just save lives. You showed everyone what true professionalism looks like." Sarah felt tears forming. "Thank you. I've been second-guessing everything." Marcus shook his head. "You made every right decision. That landing was perfect." Alone later, Sarah finally processed what had happened. She thought about standing up in the cabin, sitting in the captain's seat with 200 lives depending on her, the approach, the landing, the moment everyone was safe. The tears came, not from sadness but overwhelming emotion, the release of tension held throughout the emergency. Her phone buzzed with messages. Friends from military days reaching out. Aviation organizations offering jobs. One message stood out, from General Patricia Morrison, her former commanding officer. "Sarah, I'm proud of you. You were always the best pilot I commanded. I think you've been running from responsibility and today you stopped running. Call me when you're ready to talk about what comes next." Sarah read it 3 times, feeling the truth. She had been running from being exceptional. She had wanted to be normal. But today reminded her that exceptional abilities came with exceptional responsibilities. She called General Morrison. "I knew you'd call tonight," the general said warmly. "How are you?" Sarah smiled. "Processing. It's been quite a day." Morrison laughed. "Understatement of the year. The FAA is calling it textbook crisis management." "I think I'm ready to come back," Sarah said. "Not exactly what I was doing before, but something in aviation. I've spent 2 years trying to be invisible, and today showed me that was a mistake." Morrison's voice carried satisfaction. "I was hoping you'd say that. I have proposals for opportunities to improve aviation safety.